Rookie, thank you for sharing that. Wow. I don't even want to even imagine the environmental messes a single creep can cause if he or she heads a country, however small and rogue. Glad you nailed him. And now we'll start chapter 2, Science Sabotage. Hello, Tess. Thanks for agreeing to contribute a short story. Many of my readers are concerned with the health of the environment and will enjoy hearing how the Blue Marble Defenders deal with the worst criminals.
Helen, thanks for inviting me. In this little story, the crime is an attack on science and scientists who help us learn about how our planet functions rather than directly on the environment. The object of the crime is unusual, but the type of villain you'll see is familiar. As usual, the villains are driven by greed and power. Before I start, your reader should know that I'm a science nut. I love science. I love it because it provides the methods and tools for learning more about how the universe works, about finding solutions to complex problems, and about making our planet safer and better. My special interest is dark matter, dark energy, and other hidden particles and forces. You might think some of those things sound boring, but hang around with me long enough and I'll get you jazzed about them. I like figuring things out. My mind likes it when all the pieces fit together and I can see the complete picture of how things work. Something in me just makes me not want to quit until I can understand the relationships, the influences of the parts of a situation on one another. I know that, like the majority of scientists, well, I'll never win a Nobel Prize and I'll never have a discovery named after me. But I like being part of the great effort to advance human knowledge. Well, okay, now for the story. It'll come out in three parts as I explain. One, what was happening from my perspective. Two, the bad guy's perspective. And three, just how the action played out. So here's how I got involved. I heard that experiments at the Fermi Lab in Chicago sent a subatomic particle called the muon through a magnetic field, and it didn't behave as predicted. I was intrigued. I know, dear reader, you're probably saying to yourself, whoopee, whoopee, so exciting. Not. Well, then the scientists concluded they might have found a previously unknown force at work in the universe. Of course, I jumped on it. Why'd I jump on it? Well, for you Star Wars fan, imagine it would be like having Yoda stand next to you and saying, "There is a disturbance in the Force. And now I will explain to you how the Force actually works." Well, a muon is like an electron. It has a negative electrical charge and a property called spin, which makes it like a magnet. Now, a muon is also 200 times heavier than an electron. And I thought, whoopee, if there are more muons in the universe than previously thought, they just might be a major contributor to dark matter. I got to learn more. I read every available newspaper report and learned that a magnet was needed for Fermilab's test. It couldn't just be any old magnet. They needed a huge 50-foot magnet racetrack. They'd arranged for the only one in the U.S. to be brought in from the Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island, New York. It had already started its journey, and people had watched with amazement at this giant thing. It looked like a flying saucer, and it moved slowly on a truck. And then it was put on a barge and sent around Florida and up the Mississippi River. Now it was being trucked to Chicago. I tell you, I was desperate to get near the action, but I didn't know who to ask, and I was worried some big shot scientists at the lab they wouldn't pay any attention to a phone call from little old me. So I phoned Leo. I asked if he thought his father could help me connect to the scientists up in Fermi Lab. Well, like magic, I was on the next plane to Chicago. I took an Uber up to from the airport to Fermi Lab, walked in the front door, and It felt like I was an ant in a giant ghost town. The building was huge, and the receptionist was the only person in it. She told me the entire staff had driven out to watch the hoopla as the magnet was moved by truck at 10 miles an hour through city streets. Local people had circulated a rumor that the device was a captured UFO and it had extraterrestrial beings still in it. The crowds were sure to be huge, and it would be almost impossible for me to find the scientists, so the receptionist suggested I wait right there in Fermilab. When I turned my head around the big empty lobby, she suggested I should go upstairs and check out the experiment viewing station while I waited. Well, that made sense to me, and I headed for the viewing platform. So that's how the story started from my point of view. Now I'll introduce you to the bad guy. Most of my information is based on what the FBI told me later, after the action. The guy's name is Reginald Riveter, but he goes by the nickname Olag. He's a henchman for an evil character called Hannibal Harpy, and I understand Rookie already introduced you to him. Harpy got the money for Olag's operation from the spy services of an Asian dictator whose name I won't mention. He knew the muon experiments were about to start and he didn't want them to succeed. Why would he care, you may ask? Well, finding a new elemental force of nature would have brought prestige to the 200 or so Western scientists involved, and it could also lead to new products or, probably more important to that guy, weapons. He wanted his own scientists to catch up and make him and his country look good. And of course, he wanted a leg up on making any weapons that might come out of it. Olag's goal was to sabotage the muon experiments in a subtle way that was impossible to detect and that wouldn't be discovered for years. Pretty clever. He entered the U.S. with a tourist visa, saying he was going fishing on Lake Michigan. Well, I guess he was fishing in a sense, but not for those kind of fish you'd find in a lake. He rented a car in New York, drove to Chicago, and made his way to the Fermilab parking lot. Okay, that's what the bad guy started off with, and here's where the action part of the story begins. Big time action was I bought a soft drink from a machine in a corner of Fermilab's lobby, took the elevator to the third floor, and walked to an amazing observation deck. Windows from the roof to the ground let me see outside where a large blimp and TV news helicopters hovered in the distance, making it easy to know where the giant magnet was. Then I looked down to the lobby and reception desk, which was cool, and when I turned around, I saw an enormous room filled with fantastic looking machines that surely were to be part of the experiment. As I studied them, I realized I knew some about some of the equipment because of my research, but this was my very first time of seeing the electronic marvels with my own eyes. I was admiring how the muon experiment team had lined up their calorimeters. Those are machines that measure the total energy of elemental particles. When I heard a helicopter buzz by, turning to look outside, I saw the blimp still in the far distance and assumed the helicopter must be a TV news crew showing viewers where the magnet was headed. But the helicopter had attracted the receptionist's attention too, and she had walked outside, and she had her head up, and she was watching as it circled the building. Then a man darted from a car in the visitor's parking lot. She didn't see him. He sped in the front door. I didn't like this. It shook me. I bet to myself the guy was an unlawful intruder. I wanted to alert the receptionist or security, but with everyone watching the magnets parade, I knew I'd be lucky to find an officer. I ran to the elevator and pushed the lobby button. I got there. Lobby was empty. I walked around the wall of plants behind the desk, and I saw the glass-walled equipment room from the ground floor level. Oh, there was movement inside. The intruder was in the machine room. He was in the bank of calorimeters, the front panel of one of the 4 great boxes. It was open. The box was the size of 2 refrigerators. He was opening now one of its inside panels. I spotted a glass door to the room and I ran to it. He'd taped the latch so it wouldn't lock closed. I dashed in and zipped around the second calorimeter. Yeah! I came face to face with a guy. A fat wax mustache was barely an arm's length away. His black hair was swept back. His nose was sharp and his eyes seemed to look right through me. He wore a black tracksuit and a black baseball cap. The guy was like ice. He didn't move. He kept his right hand on what looked like a camera on a metal arm with lots of wires inside the calorimeter's guts. I took a couple of steps backwards. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "I'm calling the guard." He ignored me. Iceman, he ignored me. He turned his back to me. He methodically refolded the device's arm, snapped it into a double clip, and closed the internal panel door. Taking a step backward, he closed the front panel. Then he whirled like a cat that's been dropped. He charged with his hands out at me. Those long fingers, they wanted to strangle me. I sidestepped his lunge. I backed into a narrow aisle between the first 2 calorimeters. Black eyes riveted me from the other end. Then a man extended his hands across the aisle of the calorimeters. That oily guy was not going to get me, I thought. I squeezed through an opening next to a chilled air handler at the aisle's far end. I darted into the center of the equipment room. He wasn't chasing me. He was headed for the glass door I had entered. No way I'm letting this guy escape, I thought. His left hand was on the handle and he was shoving the door open with his right when I hit him. Ha ha! Hey, listen to this. Playing baseball with Rookie. Who knew I'd ever use the hook slide into second base that he had taught me? The guy landed hard, fortunately not on me. I popped up, opened the door latch, pulled the tape off, stepped out, closed it, and grasped the handle with all I had in me. The guy grabbed the other side and he twisted the handle. Tough luck, dude, I thought. I held firm. I wasn't sure if it was the door lock or my own strength that was keeping him in there. He tried 2 hands. I screamed. The receptionist came around the plantings. She stared. I hollered, "Call security! Call the police!" The guy ran to the other side of the equipment room, searching for a security door or some other way out. He made a quick full circle and returned to face me. I was holding the door, still in place, had both hands on it. The glare he shot me could have been lethal. Then he pulled out a large black pistol. Yeah, lethal, but this time for real. He raised it, pointed it at my face. Just then, red emergency lights flashed inside the machine room. A siren blasted in the reception area. I turned to look, and when I turned back, the gun and the guy were gone. Now he was near the elevator wall that had the smallest glass panel. He fired his pistol. The glass splintered, but it didn't break. He fired again. It didn't break. The bullets didn't go through. He ran back toward the door, toward me. He stood squarely opposite me. He pointed the gun at the crack between the door and the panel closest to my face. His glare went right through me. But he lowered the gun, grasped his right wrist with his left hand, and aimed at the door handle. I jumped to the side. He fired. The bullet bent the handle and fractured the glass, but the lock stayed intact. I retreated toward the receptionist's desk. I stopped and turned. He fired at the lock itself. It bent it back and away from the glass panel. It would go with the next shot. I had to get out of there. I turned. I ran straight into a policeman's blue uniform. The policeman held his arms out near my shoulders. 3 other policemen zoomed around us toward the machine room. I was shaking and pleased to be guided by that policeman to the lobby chair. The receptionist brought a bottle of water. Sirens wailed outside. Cars full of police arrived. The lab director appeared. He escorted me to his conference room. A police officer arrived and took my statement. FBI investigators then came in, and I spent the next 2 hours telling every minute detail about what had happened. It felt like taking the same history exam over and over and over to different teachers, and they were then going to compare my answers. The truck with the magnet, or I should say the UFO on top of it, came to rest in the parking lot, followed by a parade of onlookers. I knew it was scheduled to sit there for a few days before installation, so I didn't worry about missing anything. Instead, I asked the receptionist to call a taxi and meet me on the back side of the building away from the hoopla. I checked into my hotel, ordered a light dinner from room service, and slept like a stone. The next morning, when I checked in at the lab's reception desk, a crew had just finished installing a new window panel and glass door. A new receptionist, not the one I'd grown friendly with during the ordeal, she told me the lab director wanted me to go directly to his office when I arrived. He said, "Tess, I hope you weren't too shook up when you went to sleep last night." When I told him I was also a blue marble defender and had dealt with much worse, he added, I see. That explains why you neutralized that criminal so easily. The FBI rang me a short time ago and reported the status of their investigation. They said I was free to pass it on to you, and I was sure you'd be interested. He first related what I mentioned earlier, that Olag was employed by Hannibal Harpy and funded by an unfriendly Asian government. He said Harpy was paid to disrupt Fermilab's muon research so it would not bear fruit for years. I asked why such a guy wouldn't simply harm or, destroy the giant magnet, since it was such an easy target during his long journey from New York. Well, the lab director replied, "That's true. And the magnet would have been an easy hit, and it would have been costly to replace. That would have taken some time, but in the end, the magnet was replaceable. What's never replaceable is scientists' time, and that is what Olaf wanted to steal." The director read my puzzled look and he went on. "In your interview with the police, you said you'd seen Olaf holding a small camera protruding from an arm inside the calorimeter. Well, critical parts in that device are made with delicate, precision acrylic plastic that must only be handled with gloves on. Over time, oils and other hard-to-see contaminants can weaken and crack the acrylic. That would distort the light and signals that pass through and give false readings. Researchers would then draw wrong conclusions and build further experiments from them. The team would go in the wrong direction for years, maybe, before realizing it. A mistake like that could be so tough. And it would be devilishly difficult to sort out. What you witnessed was Olag simply placing his fingerprint on an acrylic lens. The tiny crack resulting over time from that tiny amount of body oil could have caused our 200 scientists to waste an entire decade. So I thank you." He said that with a gracious head bow, and he added, "All the scientists who will work on muon research, they thank you too." Well, of course, I said any other responsible citizen would have done the same thing. But I knew I was really lucky to receive such a tribute from a big-time scientist, and I was beaming inside. So, Helen, like in so many other things, as you see, luck can be a big part of a Blue Marble Defender's investigation.
Thank you for your story, Tess. I do see the role of luck, but I also see how attention to detail, skill, and courage led to a successful conclusion. Now we move on to Chapter 3, The Dirty Bad Guy. Hello, Leo. My thanks to you for agreeing to tell my readers about one of the environmental criminals you've had to deal with.
Glad to sit with you, Helen. I had originally planned to tell a short tale about Fred Fund, an evildoer the Blue Marble Defenders have put behind bars many times. But since Tess and Rookie have spoken about that nasty crowd from Transnistria, I'll tell you about my encounter with another one of Hannibal Harpy's henchmen, Kozlov Kamenev. I was living in Beirut, Lebanon, and taking a course in Middle Eastern politics when a warehouse full of aluminum nitrate exploded in the harbor, killing over 200 people and injuring thousands more. Electricity became unreliable. The economy became chaotic. And a month later, one of my classmates, Zena, she fell ill from food poisoning. Complicated by her other health problems, the food poisoning landed her in the hospital. I should say, rather, landed her in a tent just outside the hospital because the largest hospital in the city had been destroyed and all other health facilities were now overwhelmed. When another classmate and I visited her, we learned a dozen others had been admitted with the same E. coli poisoning. Now, when the Al Jazeera TV network broadcast that food poisoning had become a widespread problem, I decided to investigate. Hey, it's not that I was being altruistic. I just like to eat without worrying about getting sick. I quickly learned that most of Lebanon's food comes from the Bekaa Valley across the small mountain range from Beirut. The next time I visited Zena, I grabbed a few minutes with her doctors and I spoke with other patients. I learned a nasty form of E. coli caused the problem, and I got the names of the restaurants where Zena and others had eaten. On my way home, I visited those restaurants, and I learned they share a single food distributor. Its manager gave me the names and locations of the 3 farms that supply their lettuce. Now, you might wonder just how I could handle those conversations in an Arabic speaking country. As you know, I don't speak Arabic. The answer is many, if not most, Lebanese speak some amount of French. It's the legacy of their colonial past. And many younger people speak English because so much entertainment and social media is in English these days. Then I asked a professor at my school's environmental sciences department about where the harmful E. coli could originate, and I learned the most likely cause was contaminated soil. Harmful microorganisms from animals, improperly composted manure, or contaminated water could well be the culprits. But bacteria could have also been introduced when the lettuce was transported or stored. Zena suggested that I contact her brother and ask him to drive me to the 3 suspects' farms. I did, but when I asked, I said, "Hey, would you like to take a day trip?" The expression that crossed his face made clear he wasn't wild about it. I said if he would lend me his car, I'd drive myself, and he said that would be better. He lost his job because of the nitrate explosion, and he was in the middle of an intensive job search. First thing the next morning, I walked to his apartment, got the car, and headed out on the coastal road toward the Bekaa Valley. Hey, I learned in geography class the valley was the northernmost tip of the Great Rift Valley that starts in Africa, and I had seen signs of it when Rookie and my family had visited Mount Kilimanjaro long ago. I'd driven only a couple of kilometers when I pulled to the side of the road to gawk out at the cliffs of the Rausch Rocks jutting up from the nearby sea. I tell you, folks, there's so much beauty in Lebanon. It was easy to understand why the ancient Phoenicians chose this place to live, as well as why the Romans were pleased to invest in stadiums and grand buildings that, while now gone to ruin, remained absolutely beautiful. My first stop was only an hour away, and I went through orchards, vineyards, wheat, maize, and cotton fields. The valley was beautiful, but I was mindful that it was also the home to Hezbollah, the Islamic political and military group that has often fought with Israel. So I kept myself alert. With the guidance of Google Maps, I followed a small road, past a huge field of lettuce on one side, a small field empty in part, and then with something of a purplish pink color growing there, and I found the first farm I was looking for. The lady of the house told me in French that the owner was out on his tractor and his son was in the barn preparing a lettuce shipment. I walked to the barn, clearing my throat every step or two because I didn't want to startle him. I spotted him inside the barn, remained outside, and said aloud, Bonjour. The young man looked up and, with a wide smile on his face, greeted me back in French, and I walked inside. I introduced myself, explained I was trying to track down the source of my friend's food poisoning, and asked if he had any ideas. He'd heard about the outbreak and expected a visit from health officials, but nobody had come. He speculated the explosion had given them lots of other priorities. He was a friendly, outgoing guy, and as he pointed toward the horizon, he explained most of the fresh vegetables in the whole valley were irrigated by the Litani River. It suffered from uncontrolled solid and liquid domestic and industrial waste. I mean, these disposal practices, they were bad, and they were all upstream from the farms. In addition, agricultural chemicals were not regulated by the government, and upstream farmers themselves, well, they were polluters because they were not required to prevent their irrigation water from flowing back into the river with those chemicals. Shaking his head, he said unless a sustainable wastewater treatment system was built, the situation and the risk to health would not improve in the valley. As for his father's farm, it was irrigated by groundwater wells. They were regularly tested but were always shown to be pure. Of course, the Litani overflowed its banks during spring storms, and that posed risks, but it hadn't happened this year. He mentioned a pesticide spray truck had run off a road a month earlier as a current crop was being planted. Ooh, he said his father was concerned and had decided to let the nearby area lie fallow. And he planted the surrounding field with malva, a leafy plant he'd been told was safer because its lettuce-like leaves were typically cooked before being eaten. When I said I'd never heard of malva, he gave me his biggest smile and nodded his head, saying he was surprised because malva was the source for the French word for the color mauve. I told him I'd seen the field en route to the farm. But Helen, I'm a bit embarrassed to say that being a detective, I was too embarrassed to admit I'd missed the connection between that color of the crop and the color called mauve. I took my leave, decided to take an early lunch, and drove to a small restaurant I'd passed. Arriving at the same moment as another car I chatted with his driver on the way inside, and we agreed to share a table. She was employed by a Swiss non-governmental agency, or NGO, to find and identify refugees from the war then being waged in Syria. Thousands housed themselves in tents and shacks in the Bekaa Valley and had no street addresses. She couldn't just make up an address for them, so she recorded their coordinates with a GPS. That was now their address. I learned of the many difficulties refugees face to survive while I sat there with my new friend, and we ate olives, dipped our pita bread into delicious labna, a Lebanese strained yogurt, and hummus with olive oil, all capped by that delicious set of herbs called za'atar. My companion and I took leave, and I navigated the bumpy gravel road to the second farm. As I drove, I asked myself the same question I'd had since starting this quest. Would a farmer ever admit he'd sold contaminated produce? I'd convinced myself that my observation and detection skills would tell me clearly if the farmer were lying. But now I had to admit that failing to connect that purple-pink field with the color mauve, well, that meant maybe I just wasn't as sharp as I thought I was. Anyway, I pulled the car up in front of an old man with a short-brimmed field hat sitting on a wooden chair in front of his farmhouse. He sported an elaborate mustache that was twisted to points on the ends. His face was weathered, and he was smoking what appeared to be a hand-rolled cigarette. As I walked toward him, he stood and greeted me, keeping hold of the chair's arm. I introduced myself and my purpose and asked if he thought any of the tainted produce could have originated on his farm. He said his irrigation system did take water from the Litani River, but he ran it through a series of channels and holding ponds before bringing it to his fields. He'd heard about the wave of food poisoning, and he was distressed by it. Just the possibility that his farm could have poisoned someone had made him consider changing crops or even selling out. His farm had nourished thousands of people throughout his life, but he was appalled at the idea of possibly hurting someone. I asked if he would mind my walking through his fields. He had no objection and said a man who had been encouraging him in the past 2 months to change crops was also surveying his property. As I walked away, I asked what new crop he was considering. His reply set me back a step. Opium. I knew some Becca farmers raised opium, but I hadn't expected anyone to openly mention it to a stranger. I set out walking through Old Man's extensive lettuce fields with all my senses alert. The crops were at varying stages of maturity, and the field with the lettuce most ready to harvest had wooden packing cartons stacked by a corner. Then ahead of me, a light stream of water coursed over the path. Something told me it was a bit off, but I'm no farmer. I cupped my hand and brought some dirt under my nose. It smelled strange, but I figured my city slicker's uneducated nose thought all dirt smelled strange. Walking on, I saw a man near the Litani River in the distance. He was stooping to work on some device at the ground level. As I neared the man, he stood straight and then reached down for what appeared to be a rifle. His hat shielded dark eyebrows and a craggy face with a stubble beard. I approached him with open hands to show I wasn't armed. He watched me with suspicion for a few seconds, and then he slung the rifle over his shoulder. I noticed it was an Uzi. I greeted him in French, but he showed no comprehension. I said hello in English. He nodded, but didn't respond, and he started to walk away. I called out, I'd like to talk. I understand you're advising the farmer to change crops. Why's that? He turned and said in rough English, he can make more money, and besides, the water here isn't safe for food crops. As he continued to walk away, I looked down at the apparatus he'd been handling. It was a shiny aluminum sluice gate, almost brand new. It shunted river water away from the cleansing circuit and directly now onto the farm's crops. Hey, what did you do here? Does the farmer know what you're up to? This water isn't clean, I yelled. The man whirled. He pulled his Uzi from his shoulder and aimed it at me from hip level in a single smooth movement. His jacket was now open, revealing a cartridge belt and a large sheathed knife. This was a warrior in farmer's clothing. He hissed, Go on your way now, fool, or you'll go later without a leg. I stared. He made a show of slowly placing his finger on the trigger. I turned, and I took 2 steps toward the farmhouse. Then I took a deep breath, called up my courage, reached into my jacket pocket, and grabbed a handful of pellets. I turned my torso 90 degrees toward the river and with a wrist snap I'd learned in baseball practice, flipped the pellets toward the guy. The Uzi jumped in his hands and he started firing wildly. I pulled a compact aerosol container from my inside jacket pocket and pressed the nozzle. White foam jetted onto his face and chest. He dropped the Uzi. He slumped to the mud on his butt and slid on his back into the irrigation dish. I dashed forward, waded in to raise his head, got him out, and pushed his limp body up to the bank. Not waiting to catch my breath, I secured his hands behind his back with my belt. I removed my mini rattle pellets from the Uzi and collected those that had fallen on the ground. This was one tough dude. He wouldn't make a docile prisoner, I figured. So I removed his shoes and threw them into the ditch. While I was resettling the sluice gate so that it wouldn't pollute the farm, he regained consciousness. I told him to get up and walk toward the farmhouse. He snarled. He stared. He wasn't going anywhere. At least, he wasn't. Until I popped a few rounds into the mud near his shoeless feet. Well, then I made sure to keep him at least 3 meters ahead of me all the way to the farmhouse, just in case he had some special forces ninja trick up his sleeve. Well, the farmer called the local militia, explained what happened, and 3 tough-looking guys quickly zoomed up in a small van and spirited that guy away in a cloud of dust. The militia had no questions for me, and only one of them even glanced my way. I presented the Uzi to the farmer. He felt his weight in one hand, twisted the point on his mustache with the other, thanked me, and I drove away. I was pretty sure that polluted water was the source of the Beirut food poisoning epidemic, and I was certain the warrior's motive for polluting the crop was to convince the farmer to convert to opium. But I like things to hang together more tightly than that. I don't like loose ends. So I phoned Uncle Amerigo on my way back to the city. It was only then that I learned that I'd been dealing with Kozlov Kamenev, one of Hannibal Harpy's henchmen. Uncle Amerigo had been trying to locate the guy since he heard the ominous news that Harpy had teamed up with the Defender's archenemy, Fred Fund, to create and to distribute worldwide opium cigarettes. And my phone call was good for a second reason. I hadn't told Uncle Amerigo about inventing the mini rattles that I'd used to disarm Kamenev. He was excited about it, and that led to my selling a case of them to Interpol along with a case of my new aerosol foam anesthetic I call Night Night. That's night with an N, and then the second night with a K. Night Night, and I'd use that to knock out Kamenev. So, Helen, that's my story. I hope your readers will find it interesting.
Thank you, Leo. In case, like Rookie, you were missing being out on the baseball diamond, I want to point out you made a double play there. You solved a food contamination mystery and prevented a new drug crisis. And that, dear readers, brings us to the end of Everyday Bad Guys. I do hope you enjoyed these vignettes from Blue Marble Defenders. I know stories of environmental evildoers could never be as interesting and exciting as listening to my broadcast of a baseball game. So please just consider them an entertainment change of pace. Like a pitcher's changeup coming at you. So, folks, I'll take your leave now. Just remember, whenever you're looking for a snack that packs a punch, reach for Space Spuds potato chips, of course. They'll shake you like a mini rattle, and they'll never put you to sleep like a night night. The end.